Hello everybody. What a delight to see great modern architecture explained in such detail. I shall be talking in a complementary sense about the buildings which accompany those great new buildings. And everything comes as a team. And I said it earlier this evening that the two short fellows in the front are the Anglo-Saxons and the tall chaps are all our German colleagues. At the Neues Museum, we're standing on the Treppenhalle staircase at the base in the vestibule, and it was this team of people who were together for something like 12 years to take a ruined building surviving from the last war to enable it to bring together the collections of East and West Berlin. On the left-hand side you have the canal which served the site of the Neues Museum, and the buildings were the post department. You'll see these sailing vessels with their tall masts, and at the back you can see a low bridge, and it prompts the question, well, how do they get under the bridge? Well, rather like wherries, the masts are counterweighted, and so as they approach the bridge, the mast folds down, they slide through, and the mast comes up again. Very clever. On the right-hand side, you can see the Neues Museum as it was built behind the Alters Museum on the right-hand side by Schinkel, and it was the first three-story museum in the world. And quite plainly here, you can see the colonnade level, the first floor great gallery level, and then the upper level, with intersecting it between the Treppenhalle. The building had been a challenge for the GDR. They'd not had the resources to do anything with it, except for one great intervention. It sits on the sands of the River Spree on an island, and when it was built by Stuller, he used 18 local brickworks to make all the bricks that he needed. The walls are about 1 metre thick, and when the building was completed, it sank by 400 millimetres. And so it sank down into the ground, and in so sinking, established a network of cracks which were to relieve the pressure on the brickwork. On the left-hand side, you can see one of these great fissures filled in with red brickwork. We were very concerned about this, and on the right-hand side you can see how the junction between the old brickwork and the new is very unfortunate. You can see sort of that, and this is a steel tie embedded, but there is no integration of brickwork at all. We were also concerned that this had been made with sand and cement mortar rather than the lime mortar with which the building was originally constructed. And one of the decisions which we encouraged the client to make was that the building should be reinstated as a soft structure, even on its new foundations. And so we were putting forward the proposition that these intrusions which had stabilized the building while it was underpinned should actually be taken out. This is David's sketch, and on the left-hand side you can see the infill to the Egyptian courtyard, which I'll show you as a realization later on, but essentially it's putting a glass roof over the courtyard and then introducing a gallery level with tombs at lower level, from the Egyptian collection. On the right-hand side, a really fundamental decision is taken that the geometry of the circulation of the building should respect the building portions which remained, and therefore the reconstruction of the southeast risalit and the northwest galleries was to be on the same scale, the same circulation route as the original. And that was a very early decision. The pattern of destruction reflects the British bombers coming in from the southeast, dropping bombs, and so that's why the southeast and the northwest areas of the museum had been damaged. What we had to do was to look at the building as it was and to consider what we might do as an intellectual way of capturing the range of decay. So on the left-hand side, lower left, you can see a little pan in the vestibule with its original decoration surviving. Next to it, it's damaged by water and salt from above. And then on the upper ranges, you can see this bright red penetrating through, partly as brick, partly as terracotta. And the floors of the whole building are made of terracotta pots. On the right hand, you can see the illustration of where the pots have decayed, and you're looking up into a void of a drum pot. Those lightweight pots, which I'll talk about a little later on, were partly adopted because of the weight of the building subsiding so much. They needed a very lightweight floor construction. Looking at other materials, on the left-hand side, a marble column encased in a protective metal jacket, but by applying here a refinishing technique to the column, we were able to discover that the quality of the marble within was in an easily recoverable form. Things were different, however, on the right-hand side, where you've got a Silesian sandstone core clad in mortar and then fluted in a Greek fashion. And that has eroded completely with the whole of the outer surface of this material, which I'll refer to again, called marble cement, which has been cast off. You can see the skirting at the bottom, which shows the way in which the surface of the column has eroded back. There were other forms of damage as well. On the left-hand side, this is the Stuller ceiling in the Egyptian gallery, and you can see how it's a representation of hieroglyphs to give context to the exhibits. But then what are these white splodges all over the handmade paper? Well, what had happened was that a new collection had come in, the Armana collection in 1929, and that had formed a motive for the curators to redress the gallery and wish to obstruct the interpretation of Egyptian theory and study from the 1865 vision to the 1929 pattern of display. And so these are hangers which supported a false ceiling, which we'll again see later. But what it did was it left us with an artifact of great value and a difficult choice as to what we might do. On the right-hand side, you can see salt damage from uncured lime bursting through the frieze in the near Biedensal. And obviously that was to be compared with the architectural damage that I've been illustrating so far. With this analysis, we were able to work with our colleagues to produce 3 documents. One was a dictionary of what each language, German and English, meant by things like housekeeping, what we meant by repair, restoration, renovation, and recreation. And those subtleties needed much argument, and that became the dictionary of reference for the words we would use during our decade of work. We then went on to form if you like, a manifesto of approach to the new work and an approach to the repair work, and that was defined again as a document of attitude. From that we went on to individual gallery concepts. So some of the galleries had disappeared and so were new. Others of the galleries were half in existence. Others of the gallery were almost entirely existing. We also had an enormous amount of external sculpture to deal with, and this, I'm sad to say, is how we found it. It had lain there since 1943 when, with the very minimum resources available, the Russians had moved through and the GDR took over responsibility. But this sculpture had just lain on the ground, unsorted and uncared for. Some had been taken away to an airfield and laid out there. And then on the right-hand side, some attempts had been made at a Beaux-Arts restoration of some of the sculptured work, which was for us very uncomfortable to witness. Within the building, there were very many floors, and we had to make sure that they could cater for 1 million visitors a year. Obviously, the original museum was only to cater for very few visitors invited by the king to look at his private collections. The analysis of the encaustic tiling on the left led us to convince ourselves that we could reproduce many of the missing elements. And on the right-hand side, you've got a red porphyry rendered floor, which you can see has expanded with the salt. And the eventual solution was to take that material out, to grind it up, add more material, relay it and polish it. So we'd actually kept the original material but overcome the decay mechanism through salt and so on. One of the great choices was that there were opportunistic voids within the building where collapses had taken place. And it was a real debate as to whether we should or should not put the floor back. But I'd said to you that we wanted to reinstate the circulation route, and so that upper doorway at the end elevation on the left-hand side would have needed a bridge from the last arcade to the arcade above our heads from where the photograph is taken. In the end, we decided that we had all the columns, we had the bricks from the collapse, and therefore there was a case to be made for reinstating the columns, the arcading, and putting in a new floor. On the right-hand side, you can see one of these pot floors, and there was much debate as to how this floor could carry the loads of a museum. The museum, of course, said, well, we want 5 kilonewtons. And we said, well, we can provide you with a floor loading assessed on each individual structural element of the building. And there was nevertheless no facility to actually calculate what that should be. So it was decided that somehow pots had to be made, and they said, well, nobody in Berlin can make them. So I went to a potter in Petersfield, had 3 made, took them, put them on the table, and then said, we in England can make your pots, can you? And it wasn't more than a fortnight before we can make our pots. The conclusion was reached that these pots could be made in England or they could be made in Berlin. Once that was established, we were able to make a prototype vault floor and to crush it to destruction and thereby prove that this floor, even though of archaic construction, could actually carry loads of 4 or 5 kilonewtons with a safety factor of about 2.5. This is the cross-section which illustrates the lightweight floors, and you can see that they're low-pitch bowstring arches, cast iron in compression, wrought iron in tension, and they then run through the daylit galleries, which are side daylit, and on the right-hand side you can see the Treppenhalle staircase, which connected these 3 museums one to another. This is Stüller's notebook of his visit to meet Sir John Soane, who was using the same sort of pot technology as was to be used on the Neues Museum on the Bank of England. And also, these are sketches of warehouses in Manchester where Schinkel and Stüller came to visit to see the same lightweight floors within heavy brick constructions. And the collection. On the left-hand side we have Nefertiti's head, which is, if you like, the star attraction of the Neues Museum. And it's very uncomfortable to say it, but that is the 20-minute visit for the foreign tourist. The coach pulls up, and 20 minutes later the coach pulls away, having seen Nefertiti. So you get this circulation to see the star object, and you miss the wonderful cat on the right. But if you go there, please allot yourself a day if you possibly can. There are 20 galleries, and each one of them is very special. On the left-hand side, this is the Neobedensaal, and this is the condition with paper on the top left-hand side, consolidating the painted frieze. And then you can see the way in which the salt has pushed the Etruscan red off the gallery walls. On the right-hand side, this wonderful side-lit quality of light and the serried ranks of these segmental trusses. In the centre, they're enriched with zinc sculpture, which is then gilded. Zinc sculpture in Berlin is one of their great strengths and skills, which is really unrivaled. And all the skyline sculpture on the altars and the Neues Museum is all made of zinc. Unfortunately, they often had iron armatures, and therefore their conservation is challenging. I'd like you just to look at the frieze here, along there, and you can see, yes, it's damaged, but the palmate designs and acanthus designs give you the sense of what is there. As a conservator, what is necessary for us to do? Well, we'll show you later. What we were concerned about is to take the drawing on the left-hand side and say, often the thing which registers with you most is the outline of the damage. And what we should perhaps think about doing is illustrated on the right-hand side by attempting to moderate the pattern of damage, not to make it disappear, but to restore something of the feeling that Stuller had invested in his painted pots that he had put between the iron beams. And this is a rather painterly approach, but if you don't moderate or interfere with the damage of a building in an aesthetic way, then you can allow the damage to overpower the cultural artifact that you're seeking to take care of. On the left-hand side, you can see the radar study of the floor, and that shows what was beneath the encaustic floors. You've got 3 layers of screed with different layers of separation, and that allowed us to lift areas of tiling and consolidate the base so that we could be confident that the old substrate and the repaired substrate could take the weight of people who visit the museum today. On the right-hand side, we're dealing with the outside render, and here we're injecting behind the rendered face to try to save as great a quantity of the original render as we possibly can, to complement it with new treatments to the bare brickwork, which again I'll come to. This is the Römische Saal, and on the left you have the raw discovery, and on the right you have an experiment again at seeing whether there's a way in which it might be moderated. The frieze is carried through above the wall painting, and this idea of colour washing the surface just to kill some of its power and removing the bright red brickwork in the bottom right-hand side. On the outside, you can see on the left-hand picture that we have actually taken the stonework of the salvaged building, added new stonework to reinstate the nature of the building where it adjoins the southeast risalit, the brickwork on the left-hand side. And another story, I was told there was no second-hand brickwork in Berlin because it didn't conform to the DIN standard. And every brick had to conform to the DIN standard that we use. So I brought the architects from Berlin across and gave them 4,000 bricks that we were looking at second-hand at Woolwich Arsenal, and we asked each architect, 5 of them, to sort out 14 bricks from the pile which were reusable. We did that, we set them all up, and we convinced ourselves that if we could find that resource of brickwork somewhere, then second-hand brickwork was a possibility. Going back to Berlin, it was suddenly discovered that there were 2 million second-hand bricks, and that we could sort them. So we sorted them, we tested them, and we gained permission to use second-hand brickwork. They didn't have the DIN standard, but they had the test certificate of the crushing. The brickwork which we've used is slurried in this case. It's instead of leaving it raw, we've used a cream slurry to give a harmony to the surface of the wall, and then the original render, you can see it's got various colours, and this is the rubbing into the top coat of the render of Silesian sandstone in its pink, beige and brown colours. The great Treppenhalle staircase that David designed is based on Stuller's original. There were many viscosities, many studies as to whether some other form of staircase might serve the building. But it was remarkable how well this staircase which matches the one on the National Gallery, worked as a gentle way of working one's way from ground to second floor level. The walls of the Treppenhalle were once hung with frescoes. These had all disappeared, and so we just restored the brickwork and the terracotta above as a masonry box within which the new stair should sit. The new apse was provided to the Greek courtyard, and you can see there the Schiffenbein frieze, which ran right the way round and shows the escape from Pompeii. On the right-hand side, you can see the way in which the precast concrete, some of it weighing 15 tons, has been manufactured using marble aggregate. The marble aggregate was used in order to complement the fine work of the building itself. The great elements of structure and the door surrounds were all either marble cement or marble itself, and so using this material one was able to invest the precast material with a connection with the old. On the left-hand side, these cases were in the basement covered with dry rot when I came, and we were able to get them into a dry environment and then to restore them so that the Rotersaal, could express the layout of the museum before it had been damaged. On the right-hand side, the ceiling of the vestibule, the columns were splendid, the beams were damaged and needed to be stitched together, and then these are the little pans between the beams, which I'd illustrated at the beginning with a great variety of survival. The beams that are covered between them are cast iron. They had fractured with the heat, and so we used carbon fibre tape to provide a new tension zone underneath and protected it with these zinc coverings. On the left-hand side, you see that room I showed you with the arcaded columns running now to the south, all of them salvaged and refinished. On the right-hand side, there's a column in the centre where we were able to obtain matching marble, but we decided not to oil it as the original had, so that we could make plain the character of the introduced material. That's a very delicate column because with all those individual pieces, it had to be perfectly vertical. All the other columns had arcaded, and so they had all pushed away to the south. On the left-hand side, we restricted the oculus over the northeast dome in order that the light fell on the architectural decoration of the inside of the dome. And on the right-hand side, Sasha's beautiful brickwork which he built within the southeast risalit, rather like the interior of an oast house in Kent, with the clerestory above. A wonderful intervention between restored interiors. On the left-hand side, the shallow domes and the way in which the surface had been consolidated during the GDR period and had ingrained the dirt, and so we would have had to destroy the whole surface had we attacked it further. We improved matters, but were not able at all to remove what was encased in resin. In other words, one has to be very judicious. On the left-hand side, you can see that where a petition has been introduced. This petition introduced in order to separate and protect areas which were vulnerable while the building was open to the weather. And on the right, the National Gallery beyond the Bacchusal. To the left, the marble columns, and you can see that the weathering is horizontal. That results from the columns having been laid down in the courtyard, and there was much debate as to whether that should or could be removed, but it proved difficult, and we were very pleased to see it as part of the story. Shrapnel in the middle, the Russian army fought through the building room by room, and while the shrapnel was part of the story, we decided to reduce the depth of the impacts to make the shadow line slightly less exaggerated. On the right-hand side, there's a column with part of that marble cement surviving. Then on the left, the Neobedensal, after it had been repaired, and there's that cresting. Now, why did we put it all back? Well, a chap was on a ladder and he fell on it. And so what you saw before was actually wrecked by a fellow falling on it. And the insurance company who were to pay for its restoration said, we're not paying unless we have it all back. And so we had to suffer a piece of Beaux-Arts restoration, which we'll always resist. On the right-hand side, a remarkable revelation of Egyptian decorative scheme where the tombs had formerly been. On the left-hand side, a small chamber which had served as an office. And on the right-hand side, what we've done is we've tried to resist everybody's demand that we put every fragment of surviving material back where it came from. If the architectural context would have been destroyed by this bespattering of objects, we said, why can't we put it in the lapidarium? And that was really something which met a lot of resistance from the curatorial team. But from our point of view, it left the architecture to speak of architecture, and it left the objects to be studied in their own right. On the left-hand side, you can see the support around the top of the column. You can see we've left, this is where there was a case which had supported the domes before we consolidated them. On the right, the Römische Saal, which we've looked at previously. And then we move on to people within the museum. That wonderful day when Michele De Luca's cases and people visit the building. The vaults excavated down and as part of the underpinning so that they were usable for display. And on the right-hand side, we've restored the paper ceiling, and you can still see the impact of damage, but we've suppressed it so that the pattern is visible once more. And on the left-hand side, the low westerly light reminds me of the time when the great cathedral bell sounded and I had to scamper across Lustgarten to get a taxi to fly home. One of the great events and memories of the project. I'm now going to turn to the Victoria and Albert Museum and we're then on to the Saône. I'm going to go rather more quickly, but because the issues I want to concentrate on are rather less broad. The galleries have been reconfigured in order to overcome something that we'd studied on the V&A. We did a study of the changes of level and disabled access, and we found there were 54 changes of level within the museum because the site slopes down from the north, and each level of the museum had been built incrementally at a slightly different level. And that was why this scheme was promoted, because it allowed the redisplay of the collection and also the resolution of that problem. But this is the picture of the gallery you see, but we'd rather like you to think of it like this. This is the screen which we think of as a medieval ecclesiastical screen, and you can see how we were keen to establish the quality of light in, if you like, the nave of the church, and then the chancel beyond. And that is a characteristic which had not been invested in the building at all. It had been just a shed with objects within it. And this, I think, just makes the point that there are two galleries and that they're of totally different character. In order to resolve the level changes, we had to intervene with Aston Webb's work, and that was really quite indigestible for English heritage. We were going to say this building doesn't work and the history of the building needs to be amended in order to make it work for today, and also to make it work much better than it does at the present time. On the right-hand side, you can see two staircases which were built through these two arches. We wanted to remove those. These are the staircases, and you can see how they fight with the architecture of the colonnaded passageway across the galleries. They were quite easy to look at in terms of disentanglement, made up of thin slips of marble over the brick form, and therefore we felt encouraged that what was put together might be taken apart. And so we prepared, after many sketches which I haven't time to go through, a drawing on the left-hand side which takes the colonnade at first floor level and brings it forward into the galleries in such a way that it completes the architecture of the colonnade and presents it as a termination rather than allowing it to disappear into curious staircases. We took the brick wall and put in this 5-ring arch to form the case within which the new stonework could sit. We have a glass lift on the left-hand side of the picture, which Muma designed so that obviously vertical circulation could be introduced at that point, a new intervention. And where I'm standing, then there is a new staircase as well, so that the staircase function is taken out of the corridor. And standing back on the left-hand side, you can see once again the way in which the corridor comes through the existing brick wall, Of course, the engineer wanted to fill the brick wall with concrete, but we said, well, the Romans have been building arches for some time. I'm sure it will be fine. And so he said, well, be it on your head, which is a very nice thing for an engineer to say. The staircase, Moma designed this very nice folded reinforced concrete staircase with a stainless trim. I just wonder whether it might have been like Burlington House, where Spencer and Norman designed this glass staircase to allow light through. But I think what's nice is that they're both very elegant staircases in different locations. One of the interventions was to take the curved apsidal end of what I'll call the chancel of Gallery 5, and to put a new roof on it so that it could take some of the larger exhibits of the museum, the French timber staircase and the Bishopsgate House particularly. We had to take out a whole level of building in order to do that, and this is our repair drawing for the brick elevation you've just seen. So on the left hand side, the whole of the lower section of that is reconstructed, and this is the way in which we were able to get the glass beams to stand on top of the parapet so that they appeared over the top of the parapet, and on the other flank walls at the other ends of the beams we cut pockets into the brickwork so that the glass would appear to just disappear into the brickwork surface rather than having padstones or spreaders or those sorts of things. We could, of course, have done a separate frame within the structure, but we elected to leave the brickwork walls as the curtain around the space and then the glass roof over the top. And so I now want to just come to Sir John Soane's Museum, and I'll just very quickly take you on a little circuit round the latest part of a restoration program which goes back about 25 years. In the left-hand side, a wonderful discovery. Soane lived in a very small flat within the museum itself. And this light shaft was something which we had suspected, but only when we started dismantling part of a roof light were we convinced that indeed it had been arranged as we see here. On the right-hand side you can see a view looking into the light well with the light above, and his use of light as shafts and as a three-dimensional spatial gameplay which he does with light is quite masterful. This was the central characteristic feature of his flat and of his private rooms. It provides a fulcrum, which means you can never get lost, however chaotic the building might appear. One of the key things he had within his private quarters was the model stand with his studies of models, the cork models repaired in Germany, and these were used for his Royal Academy lectures to young architects learning their profession. The use of bleached floors and mahogany is typical of his work. The wallpaper is again based on, I'll show you, original patterns. round this fireplace around, you can see the original wallpaper, much bleached, and so we had one of the things about the Soane Museum is that it has a quite remarkable archive, and therefore we could find in the receipts a receipt for 22 rolls of wallpaper, where it was made, what the colours were, and had we been able to do this project 5 years ago, we would have gone to Coles in Islington and asked them to make it, whereas we had to go to America to get them to hand block it for us. But you see the use to the right of the fireplace of mirror. Soane not only introduced light shafts into his building, but uses mirror to reflect light and to extend perspective in a most magical way. This fireplace that we're looking at is next to really a very ordinary domestic appliance. It is his bath, and there were fragments of this remaining. There were watercolours of what it was like, and so by disentangling what survived, we were able to put together a recreation of this most elegant abluting facility. And to the left, his bedroom with this is not his bed, this is a bed from Pitshanger Manor where we're working at the moment, and it's there until his bed is constructed. On the right you have a belvedere window which looks into his wonderful staircase with its painted and grained wallpaper and the stained glass which he collected, much of it from the Low Countries, at a time when stained glass was unfashionable, and the collection he has is quite remarkable in that regard. On the left-hand side, the morning room, and on the right-hand side, we've come back to the model room. So what we've done is to walk round that central feature of the light shaft round his domestic quarters. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Julian, thank you very much for a very good talk. We had the privilege earlier of having you in a workshop, and during that workshop you were talking to us about, let's say, your hesitation at engaging in reconstruction.
Yeah.
You were just mentioning at the end there the recreation of this most elegant of abluting facilities, the bathtub.
Yes.
When you said recreation, what do you mean exactly?
Well, I would do at the Soane what I wouldn't dare to do anywhere else, because in 1837 Sir John Soane was disappointed with his sons, who didn't want to follow him into architecture and form an architectural dynasty, so he left his collections and the buildings to the state. And with that, all the receipts going back to 1792 of everything that had gone on in the house. So there are, for instance, receipts for buying candles for candlelit events and soirees. There are the receipts for the wallpaper. There are the receipts for each one of these models. There are things which just wouldn't be available in any other circumstance where the state hadn't been able to protect the archive as well as the building. So that's where I'm saying that with the combination of the fragmentary remains of what was there and the receipts from the carpenter who made it, we would venture to do the recreation that I would not dare to do anywhere else.
showed some horizontal damage because they were laid down, and you chose to do something about the bullet holes to make them like slightly.
Well, there were two reasons really. The lying down of the columns, the curators wanted us to clean all the black off because they said that story of it, them lying down, was not important. It's this question I was talking about earlier of palincestrous layers of change and how do you evaluate them. Now, from my point of view, I didn't want to take it off because I wanted to tell the story of you're looking at this column and the weather goes this way. What's happened? It was obvious that the column was like that. So I didn't want to do it. I shouldn't say this, but when we tried to clean it off to please the curators, we found it very difficult, shall I say. And because it was very difficult, they said, oh, well, if you can't do it, and they looked at us down their noses, you know, you can't do this, I suppose we'll have to live with it. Well, it was one of those little nice debates which you have between really enthusiastic people. I'm delighted that they're left there. Now, the shrapnel was too powerful. The anger, the viciousness of the battle through the building was too strong that it overpowered the cultural significance of the building. And so I think that what we felt was that we couldn't expunge the shrapnel damage, which many people wanted us to do because they found it offensive. They didn't want to remember that. So what we did was, where it was about 18 millimetres thick, deep, we reduced it to about 6 or 7 millimetres by just filling it in gently to leave the arris of the damage, but not to get such a dark shadow line, so that when you look at it at a distance, there's something going on, and as you come closer, so you learn more about the building and you can see what's happened. So those, I hope, are the two answers.
So my question is, the three projects that you showed us were very different from one another. What process did you like from each of them, and which was your favorite?
Well, the one that imprinted itself most on my memory is probably the Noise Museum because it was 12 years long. Maybe the Soane, which is 25 years long, is equal, but the Soane is more like mending a musical box. It is so exquisite, so tiny. You are involved in every detail, every screw and every little piece of ironmongery, every character of finish, every piece of wood. I would say that our intervention and working with Muma at the V&A was much more like working with Norman Foster at the Burlington House, where we had a major intervention to manage in conservation terms with the needs of the museum. So I chose these three projects because they were very different. They're the work of an architect working in the field of conservation.
Thank you very much.